Episode 3, Tensions, the Rise of China and the Future of Superpowers. This audiobook will cover lessons 13 to 19 from the Geography Superpowers topic. Information was procured on the appropriate booklet, worksheets, and PowerPoint presentations. Lesson 13, Tensions between Superpowers. A sphere of influence is a physical region which extends beyond the borders of a country. It is the area over which a country believes it has economic, military, cultural, or political rights. Tensions can develop where ownership of resources is disputed and disagreements exist over exploitation. For example, by planting a Russian flag on the seabed under the North Pole in 2007, Russia symbolically claimed rights to the seabed and its resources. Russia claims that the Lomonosov Ridge, an underwater mountain range located under the North Pole, is an extension of the Russian landmass as it is geologically linked to the Siberian continental shelf. 9 counties have territorial claims in the Arctic, namely Canada, Alaska, and in turn the United States, Greenland, which is owned by Denmark, as well as Finland, Iceland, Norway, and lastly Sweden. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that 30 of the world's undiscovered gas and 13 of oil reserves are in the Arctic. Much of the dispute centers around the area known as the Lomonosov Ridge. There are also $1 trillion of rare earth materials, and it's noted that if a country controlled the Arctic's vital shipping routes, they would be able to trade quicker and make higher profits. It is, for example, believed that these seas lanes could cut the journey time between New York and Shanghai by a week. The number of scientific expeditions to the Arctic has increased as countries seek to have a greater presence in the area. Both Russia and Canada have created dedicated Arctic forces to protect their interests. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, no country owns the Arctic. Countries bordering the Arctic are entitled to a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone from their coastlines. Superpowers are more interested in the Arctic region now because global warming and subsequent melting has made the area more accessible. Russia, for instance, gets 10% of its GDP and 20% of its exports from the Arctic. It is getting ready to defend the territory by stepping up military activity in the polar region. It is renovating old ports along the Northern Sea route. Russia is hoping to collaborate with China as they are trying to attract investment in infrastructure in the area, as there has been less investment from the West since they invaded Crimea. They are also looking at connecting the Northern Sea route to China's maritime Silk Road. In 2018, China declared itself a near-Arctic state, even though its northernmost point is 900 miles from the Arctic Circle. They are looking to carve out sea routes and secure resources. Trump discussed trying to buy Greenland from Denmark. They also have a recently launched naval fleet in the Arctic and are building a fleet of icebreakers to ensure that they can use the shipping routes and have the ability to support and rescue ships using the dangerous routes. Russia has invested in Barentsburg, Svalbard, to extend their influence in the region and establish an economic claim to the land. They are investing in tourism opportunities with hotels, bars, museums telling the story of Russian presence in the Arctic. They are trying to project Russian identity and influence in the region. They also have an Arctic brigade who conduct training, military exercises, and have helped reopen old and build new military bases. They have 45,000 troops in the region, as well as 3,000 military vehicles, 40 ships, 15 submarines, and 100 aircraft. In a similar style to Russia, China is trying to claim 90s of the South China Sea because it is rich in resources. It has vast oil and gas supplies, is home to 10 of world fisheries, and is the water in which 30 of shipping trade passes through. 5 countries lay claim to the area. The Spratly Islands, for example, are claimed by China, Vietnam, Philippines, and Malaysia. In theory, each country should have their ease and areas outside that 4 under maritime law, meaning everyone shares it. Tensions escalated when China started building artificial islands, such as Fiery Cross Island, and creating military bases in the region. The US presence is seen as encroachment in China's backyard. As a superpower, US uses its navy to defend international waters through freedom of navigation missions and military patrols. US is in a tricky position as it doesn't want to risk provoking a conflict with China, but simultaneously wants China to stop bullying its allies in the region. Lesson 14: Intellectual Property Rights. Intellectual property protection helps you to stop people stealing or copying the names of products or brands, inventions, the design or look of products and things a company or individual writes, makes or produces. These rights can include copyrights, patents and trademarks, and may be enforced by law. The reason for having intellectual property rights is to encourage innovation without the fear that a competitor will steal the idea and/or take the credit for it. Global system of IP has been run since 1967 by the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is part of the UN. It ensures that TNCs, individuals and government agencies can protect inventions, trademarks, artistic works and trade secrets from use by others. The Patent Office in Kenya has issued a total of 589 patents since 1990, one compared with 5,500 patents issued by the US office in 1 week. Most Kenyan patents are granted to foreign firms, most of which are pharmaceutical companies. This begs the question, what are the pros and cons of intellectual property rights? Number 1. IP holders do not have a duty to make a new invention available. In theory, at least, they could prevent a new medicine being made. Number 2. Without IP, innovations and ideas can be stolen and used by others. Number 3. IP requires users of a product to pay royalties to the inventor, which is a cost to developing countries. Number 4. Without IP, there would be a huge disincentive to innovate and invent. Number 5. The system can create a monopoly where a patent holder can charge what they like for a new product, denying it to some people on the basis of price. Number 6. The costs of developing new medicines or communication technologies could not be recouped through selling products if others could simply copy the idea. China is often portrayed as a land of copycats, where you can buy a pirated Superdry t-shirt or a hip hone, and where smaller cities boast T-Bucks outlets and KFG fried chicken shop. Counterfeiting today is a multi-billion-dollar business in China, which produces nearly 9 of every 10 fake items seized at its borders. A notable case in recent years was a Chinese company selling a copycat of Jaguar Land Rover's Evoque model for a fraction of the price. In 2019, the courts ruled that the production of the Landwind, costing just $14,000 compared to the $40,000 Evoque, had to stop immediately. Behind the fake items on display in markets and shopping streets lies a deeper intellectual property issue. Chinese companies have consistently sought to play catch-up by piggybacking on other people's technological advances. They have pursued software and industrial formulas both through legitimate means, hiring in expertise, buying up startups, tracking publicly available information, and questionable or downright illegal ones. For example, digging genetically modified seeds out of the fields of Iowa so they can be smuggled on a Beijing-bound flight. According to Western governments, business experts, analysts and security experts, Chinese businesses are routinely benefiting from the theft of intellectual property. Companies doing business in China are advised to take clean laptops rather than their usual work devices on trips to ensure that their work is protected with patents and trademarks internationally, and to be careful about the information they hand over to partners or potential manufacturers. But their greatest vulnerability is operating in the age of the Internet. The director of the US National Security Agency has described commercially targeted cyberattacks as the greatest transfer of wealth in history. Such intrusions cost the US $300 billion a year, with China responsible for up to 80%. The Chinese government is stepping up its intervention. Courts could soon be overwhelmed by cases, and the blatant sale of counterfeit goods has been curbed somewhat. China has signed landmark deals with the US and the UK, agreeing not to conduct or support hacking and intellectual property theft for commercial gain. Apparently, intrusions on commercial targets have now fallen by as much as 90%. China has long been seen as a counterfeiter's haven and has constantly been criticized by its trade partners over lax protection of intellectual property rights. Multinational corporations doing business in China face a losing battle when it comes to keeping copies of their products off the market, with anti-counterfeiting investigators either collaborating with producers of the fake goods or copying the goods themselves, according to a report. China remains on the US priority watch list of trading partners that fail to protect such rights. President Trump was involved in trade wars with China, with one criticism being that China was not cracking down on piracy and counterfeiting. He accused China of robbing hundreds of billions of dollars worth of American ideas, estimated to be around $600 billion a year. Lesson 15, the rise of China and India. There is no doubt that Asia is, or very soon will be, the dominant global region. It hosts India, China, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, and Malaysia, all of which are powerful countries. It is widely expected that by 2050, Asia will be by far the world's most populous continent, and as a continent, will have the world's largest GDP by 2030. There could be a strong case for India, and even Indonesia, to have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. China's Belt and Road Initiative was announced in 2013 and aims to boost trade and influence by building infrastructure such as ports, railways, roads, airports, mines, oil refineries, and gas pipelines. It includes over 150 countries, equal to nearly 75% of the world's population and 50% of the world's GDP. It is a giant infrastructure project costing $4 to $8 trillion, designed to reroute global trade. The belt is overland and the road is the maritime link. A $62 billion corridor known as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is where the belt and the road meet. Chinese construction companies build the infrastructure, increasing jobs and income. It provides an alternative route to import oil and gas from the Middle East to secure energy supplies. It strengthens China's soft power too. Pakistan saw its highest GDP growth in 8 years and developed a close relationship with a world power. But there are fears it might not be able to repay its debt, and that it will have to accept increased influence from China. The process of China lending money to countries that suffer from corruption and conflict means that many risk being unable to repay loans. China has control of a port in Sri Lanka after Sri Lanka couldn't repay debt. There are similar arrangements in other countries, as China has built its first overseas naval base in Djibouti. This has led to the string of pearls theory. This is the idea that China is trying to set up a string of naval bases in the Indian Ocean to guard shipping routes and control trade. Tensions between India and China. The border between the two rising powers is not clearly demarcated, and not many people live there to establish a claim, tactically significant for trade, for water supplies, and for future military action. India believes China wants to establish a unipolar Asia dominated by China. In the 1950s, China sent troops into Tibet and annexed the region. The Dalai Lama and Tibetan refugees fled to India. China considers Indian support for the Dalai Lama to represent a threat to their sovereignty and authority. Tensions reached a peak in 1962 when a war was fought, thousands died, and China retained land. The border between the two rising powers is not clearly demarcated, and not many people live there to establish a claim. Tactically significant for trade, for water supplies, and for future military action. India believes China wants to establish a unipolar Asia dominated by China. In the 1950s, China sent troops into Tibet and annexed the region. The Dalai Lama and Tibetan refugees fled to India. China considers Indian support for the Dalai Lama to represent a threat to their sovereignty and authority. Tensions reached a peak in 1962 when a war was fought. Thousands died and China retained land. China says India has built roads, tunnels and refurbished airfields in the area. India says China has increased troops and built new villages. China is employing a strategy of salami slicing to assert territorial claims in small steps by establishing a presence, bit by bit. India has responded by increasing its military presence, banning Chinese apps, the boycott of the BRI Forum, and the cultivation of closer diplomatic ties with West through Quad, a political grouping between USA, India, Japan, and Australia. The USA supports the rise of India as a counterbalance to China's growing power. As a democracy which rivals China, it can help the US to maintain their superior position, as it will mean China tackling India as well as the USA. Tensions between China and Taiwan. China considers Taiwan to be part of China, but Taiwan considers itself to be an independent nation. In 1949, at the end of the Chinese Civil War, the government was defeated and fled to Taiwan. More and more Chinese aircraft have recently been entering Taiwan's air defense zone. This might be due to Taiwanese president wanting to claim independence or because of increased international military activity in the region, which has provoked China. Taiwan is seen as a bargaining chip between USA and China. USA has committed to defend Taiwan, but not said how. The USA conducts military exercises in the area, has troops stationed in Taiwan, has military bases across the region, and recently announced a UK-US to increase its presence in the region. Lesson 16. China in Africa. China has become Africa's largest trade partner and has provided huge loans to boost development of the continent. Africa is a vast market for Chinese goods. This is an example of the multiplier effect as well as Frank's dependency theory. Influence in Africa increases China's soft power and thus increases its sphere of influence. China's mainly imports crude oil, cotton and iron ore, and receives oil as payment for debts. China could gain control of infrastructure if countries cannot repay their debts. Moreover, construction contracts for Chinese firms and workers leads to migration remittances. This relationship gives Africa a market for its raw materials. They are receiving investment in infrastructure. This would include the Mombasa-Nairobi standard gauge railway. It gives them access to cheap loans with no or fewer strings attached, as China is less worried about human rights issues or outstanding debts. In addition to this, Africa can access affordable goods, improve its quality of life, infrastructure, and create opportunities for employment. However, China might not get all its money back, as many African countries are at risk of defaulting on debt. On a smaller boat, Zambia owes China nearly $9 billion and is a victim of debt trap diplomacy. If for whatever reason China's economy struggles, this could have wider impacts across Africa. There has also been ecological impacts as the Mombasa-Nairobi standard gauge railway cuts through a major national park. Workers have also been exploitation by the Chinese, who are choosing to send their money back home instead of spending it. This leads to leakage. Lesson 17. The Middle East. Of all the global regions, the Middle East is the one that has been most unstable over the last 50 years. Tensions in the Middle East present a challenge to global superpowers. This is due to complex geopolitical relations on one hand, combined with ensuring supplies of essential energy resources on the other. There are a number of sources of instability, tension, and conflict. The Israel-Palestine conflict is a territorial conflict which began in the early 1900s. Israel-Palestine was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, who were religiously diverse and ensured peace. Palestinians were developing a national identity, and the Zionist movement pushed for a nation-state for Jews. Jews consequently started to migrate to the region. After the Ottoman Empire collapsed and UK and France carved region up between them. In British Palestine, tensions between Jews and Arabs grew. As a result of the Holocaust, large numbers of Jews fled Europe for British Palestine, and much of the world began to support the idea of establishing a Jewish state. The UN approved a plan to split British Palestine into two states, Israel as a Jewish state and Palestine as an Arab state. Jerusalem would have a special international status. Israel declared independence in 1947, but Arab states rejected the plan, viewing it as European colonialism. Many Arab states declared war on Israel, which climaxed with the Arab-Israeli War, which lasted from 1948 to 1949. Israel, backed by the USA, won the war and extended their borders. This forced huge numbers of Palestinians to leave their homes, with a current Palestinian refugee population of about 7 million. The Six-Day War in 1967 led to Israel seizing more land, including the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Israel now occupied all of the Palestinian territories and was governing Palestinians. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the US-organized Camp David Accords. This marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Israeli military still occupied Palestinian territories of West Bank and Gaza. The Palestinian Liberation Organization began to fight against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Originally, PLO wanted to end the State of Israel entirely. Years of fighting and wars followed. Israel started building settlements in the West Bank, housing hundreds of thousands of Jewish settlers. These are considered to be illegal by the international community. These exacerbate tensions, displace Palestinians, and make it more difficult for Palestinians to have their own state. Palestinian frustration exploded into the First Intifada. Conflict and violence continued from 1987 to 1987 to 1993, killing 200 Israelis and over 1,000 Palestinians. Hamas was consequently formed, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. Both sides have been working towards peace since early 1990s, but extremists on both sides tried to sabotage the process. Progress continues to be difficult and slow, and conflict continues, with sporadic fighting and violence. The Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005 was more violent, as 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians were killed. Israelis become skeptical that Palestinians will ever accept peace and built walls and checkpoints to manage the conflict. Hamas gained power in Gaza and split from the Palestinian Authority. Israel imposed a blockade on Gaza, controlling movement of goods and people in and out. Unemployment rose to 40%. In West Bank, the number of Israeli settlements continued to grow. Violence and protests continue. In Gaza, Hamas and other violent groups have periodic wars with Israel. The fighting kills far more Palestinians than Israelis, including lots of civilians. See affiliated worksheet for more case studies. Lesson 18 and 19, The Future of Superpowers. Military spending is questioned in some superpowers as maintaining a policy of austerity while expanding military power is a difficult and controversial policy decision. Difficult military campaigns in Afghanistan dented confidence in the effectiveness of Western military power. The cost of military technology is extremely high because it involves the latest technologies. Trident. Since 1969, according to government documents, a British submarine carrying nuclear weapons has always been on patrol, gliding silently beneath the waves, somewhere in the world's oceans. The logic is to deter a nuclear attack on the UK because, even if the nation's conventional defense capabilities were destroyed, the silent submarine would still be able to launch a catastrophic retaliatory strike on the aggressor, a concept known as mutually assured destruction. There are 4 submarines and each one carries up to 8 Trident missiles. Each missile can be fitted with a number of warheads, which can be directed at different targets. All the submarines carry a sealed letter of last resort containing instructions to follow if the UK has been devastated by a nuclear strike and the government annihilated. It was acquired by the Thatcher government in the early 1980s as a replacement for the Polaris missile system which the UK had possessed since the 1960s. Trident then came into use in the 1990s. There are 3 parts to Trident: submarines, missiles and warheads. Although each component has years of use left, they cannot last indefinitely. The current generation of 4 submarines would begin to end their working lives sometime in the late 2020s. The government argues that the UK faces an uncertain future threat environment. It is impossible to foresee the emergence or re-emergence of nuclear threats sufficiently far in advance, so it is critical to renew the Trident system, especially in light of the resurgence of aggressive Russian policies. In that uncertain environment, the argument is made that the UK needs to ensure it is taking decisions now which mean that in future decades we have options available for defence and deterrence. Although Trident submarines, missiles and warheads have years of use left, they cannot last indefinitely, and work on a replacement cannot be delayed because the submarines alone could take up to 17 years to develop. Supporters of replacement argue that threats from rogue states and terrorist groups could emerge at any time and a minimum nuclear deterrent is needed to help counter them. The nuclear defense industry is also a major employer. Some estimates suggest that up to 15,000 jobs may be lost, as well as considerable expertise if a new batch of submarines is not commissioned. Some who object on ethical grounds say the UK should never be a country that is willing to threaten or use nuclear weapons against an adversary, even in the most extreme circumstances, and that the humanitarian consequences of doing that would be so grotesque as to be unfathomable. Others who object on the basis of cost assessments say that the UK should not be spending possibly £40 billion on a programme that is designed for uncertainty, and indeed that an uncertain future threat environment may mean no threats arise, and so £40 billion would have been spent unnecessarily. There are still others who suggest that actually it is not so uncertain, and the prospect of a significant threat arising to the UK in the timeline of the successor submarines is so remote as not to be worth taking significant action now. Finally, it could be argued that having a powerful nuclear ally in the US, Britain does not need an atomic weapons system of its own. One of the most notable symbols of global power has been the Russian and US space programs. Russia was the first country to put a man into space in 1961, while the USA was the first to land a human on the moon in 1969. Only a few countries or partnerships are committed to space exploration, primarily the USA, Russia, the EU, China, Canada, Japan, and India. However, space budgets are under threat in many Western countries, while China and India have now adopted major space programs and are able to launch space flights much more cheaply. Since 9/11 and the subsequent terrorist attacks in Paris, London and elsewhere, government budgets have become increasingly directed towards anti-terrorism work. There is a need for both human spies, as well as artificial intelligence, satellite technology, and electronic interception of mobile phones, email, and social media. It is deemed an essential service by many, as it has uncovered a number of terrorist plots across Europe before terrorists could strike.